The fence posts had been lying in the ditch along the east edge of Earl Meadows' property for going on 3 years by the time anyone paid them any mind. Cedar, most of them. Some locust. The ones at the far end had been there long enough that the bark had gone gray and started to peel, and where they had lain in the wet soil all winter, black streaks ran up the wood like something had been trying to climb out. Earl had meant to burn them in the fall of the previous year, and then the year before that. He never got around to it. That was the kind of thing that happened on farms in Mays County, Oklahoma. The list of things you meant to do got longer, and the daylight didn't. So the posts just lay there. And nobody looked at them. Nobody except one person. Most people who find a story like this one find it because somebody told it to them in passing. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. The boy's name was Marcus Webb. He was 14 years old in the summer of 2009, and he was tall for his age in the way that makes grown men uncomfortable, without knowing exactly why. He didn't live in town. He lived 4 miles east of town, on a leased parcel his grandmother worked as a truck garden, about 11 acres of black soil that ran down to a creek lined with cottonwood. The garden sold sweet corn and okra and butter beans at a folding table off Highway 28 on Saturday mornings. The truck was a 1994 Ford F-150, green with a white stripe, and it had rust along both rear-wheel wells that Marcus's grandmother said was from a previous owner who had driven too near the coast. Marcus was not farming that summer. He had a summer, and he had energy, and he had a wagon. The wagon was a yard wagon, the kind with pneumatic tires and a steel bed, hitched to an old 3-speed bicycle. He had built the hitch himself out of angle iron and 2 U-bolts and a length of chain. It wasn't pretty. It worked. He showed up at Earl Meadows' ditch on a Thursday morning in June. He knocked on the farmhouse door first and asked if he could haul off the fence posts. Earl Meadows told him yes without asking why, which was the way Earl operated. Earl Meadows did not have opinions about things that cost him nothing. What Earl did not do was tell his neighbors. What his neighbors saw over the following 2 weeks was a black boy on a bicycle hauling dead fence posts down a county road in a wagon. 3 loads the first week. 4 the second. On one of those trips he had so many posts stacked crosswise in the wagon that the bed was sitting maybe 4 inches off the tires, and the tires were splaying out at the bottom from the weight. Not one person stopped to ask what he was doing with them. The general interpretation, as best as it can be reconstructed, was that he was hauling them somewhere to burn them. Probably for someone. Probably for a few dollars. That was what boys did in the summer. They ran small errands for small money. The older men who saw him from their tractors or their truck windows gave him the kind of look you give a person doing something harmless and slightly confusing. Then they drove on. A man named Phil Decker, who ran the co-op grain elevator on the north end of town, saw the boy on the road twice in the same week. He mentioned it to his wife. He said the boy had to have 50 fence posts in that wagon. His wife said that was a lot of fence posts. Phil said it was. He didn't think about it again for 3 months. Marcus Webb was not burning the posts. His grandfather had told him about charcoal. This was the part that mattered, and it started 11 years before that June morning in a trailer house outside Wagoner, Oklahoma, where Marcus's grandfather, a man named Deshaun Webb, who had worked as a welder for 31 years before his hands gave out, kept a stack of notebooks on a shelf above the kitchen table. Those notebooks were not a journal. They were closer to a ledger. Deshaun Webb wrote down what worked. He wrote down what didn't. He had been writing in them since 1978, and when he died in the spring of 2008, he left 14 of them to Marcus's grandmother in a cardboard box with the boy's name written on the side in black marker. Marcus had read all of them by November of that year. He was 13. The notebook from 1991 was the one that mattered most. In it, Deshaun Webb had spent 6 pages describing a man he'd worked with at a fabrication shop in Muskogee. A man named Gerald Pittman, who had grown up in a farming family in Arkansas and who had, for several years in the early 1980s, made a significant portion of his income selling charcoal he produced himself. Not briquettes. Lump charcoal, the real kind, made in a retort kiln, from hardwood or dense softwood, sealed and burned slow at a controlled temperature, until what you had left was almost pure carbon. Gerald Pittman had sold it to a restaurant supply outfit in Little Rock for years before the operation got too big for him to manage alone. Deshaun Webb had written down every detail Gerald told him. Temperatures, wood types, moisture content, the size of the retort. The way you knew the process was done by the color of the smoke coming out of the vent. Yellow meant moisture still cooking off. White gray meant you were getting close. And a thin blue, almost invisible plume meant you had finished carbon and it was time to start cooling. He wrote it down the way he wrote down everything. Plain. Complete, without any particular expectation that it would ever be useful. Marcus read it. He understood it. He was the kind of boy who, when he read something that made sense, retained it the way other people retain faces. He spent the winter of 2008 to 2009 building a retort kiln out of 2 55-gallon steel drums, a length of pipe, and a damper he fabricated himself from sheet metal. He set it up at the back of his grandmother's property, behind the garden in a clearing near the cottonwoods. He burned his first load of wood in February and ruined it. Too much moisture. Not enough patience. He burned the second load in March. That came out better. By April, he had a process. By May, he had a pile of lump charcoal that weighed, by his own rough measurement on a bathroom scale, about 340 pounds. He had no idea what to do with 340 pounds of charcoal. That was when Earl Meadows' fence posts came into it. Cedar and locust, it turned out, are very good kiln wood. They are dense. They are dry when they have been lying in the open air for 2 or 3 years. They produce a lump charcoal that burns hot and long and does not ash out quickly, which is what you want if you are grilling or smoking or running a forge. Marcus did not know all of this going in. He learned it. He ran 3 batches from the Meadows posts over the first 2 weeks of July, working in the mornings before the heat peaked, and what he ended up with was something close to 600 pounds of charcoal in 20-pound paper bags that he had stapled shut and stacked under a tarp behind the kiln. He made a sign on a piece of cardboard with a black marker. He drove with his grandmother to 10 Killer Feed and Ranch Supply on the first Saturday of August and asked to speak to the manager. The manager's name was Ron Gable, and he had been managing feed stores in eastern Oklahoma for 22 years. He was not unkind. He was also not going to be convinced by a cardboard sign. He looked at the sign. He looked at the boy. He said, "Where'd you get this charcoal?" Marcus said he made it. Ron Gable said, "Made it how?" Marcus explained the retort kiln. He explained the difference between lump charcoal and briquettes in about 4 sentences. He named the wood types and why they mattered. He was not nervous. He was informed. Ron Gable told him he'd take 2 bags on consignment and see what happened. He didn't say it as a kindness. He said it the way you say something when you want a boy to understand that the world requires proof. The 2 bags sold in 11 days. Ron Gable called Marcus's grandmother and said he'd take 10 more. He didn't explain why. She told Marcus. Marcus brought 10 bags. Those sold in 8 days. The next order was 20 bags. Then, 30. By October of 2009, 10 Killer Feed was ordering 40 bags a month, and Ron Gable had started telling people he sold local hardwood lump as a distinguishing feature of his store, because none of the other farm supply outfits in the county carried it. A restaurant in Tahlequah called Stonegate, a place that did a lot of business on weekends and ran a wood-fired grill in the back, had started buying 12 bags a month on its own. Marcus was 14 years old. He had made, by the end of that calendar year, $2,840 from Charco. He did not tell anyone at school. He did not tell anyone except his grandmother and, eventually, Ron Gable's inventory manager, a woman named Patricia Cross, who offered to help him file a DBA so he could have a business account at Mays County Bank. She did this because she had seen a few things in her years that she felt deserved to continue. Phil Decker, the man from the grain elevator, found out the following spring when his wife bought a bag of the charcoal to use for a cookout. She told him it was local. He looked at the bag. The bag said Webb Lump, Mays County, Oklahoma in stamp letters. He stood in his driveway, holding the bag for a moment, thinking about a boy on a bicycle hauling fence posts down a county road. He didn't laugh. He wasn't that kind of man, but he'd assumed, the same as everyone else, and he stood there and owned it for a minute before he carried the bag to the back patio. Marcus Webb is 29 years old now. He runs a biomass charcoal operation in Adair County, producing about 14 tons of lump charcoal per year, sold through 11 retail accounts and 3 restaurant accounts across northeastern Oklahoma and northwestern Arkansas. The retort kiln is bigger now. 3 chambers, a commercial damper system, and a cooling rack his uncle helped him fabricate out of steel angle iron in 2017. The notebooks are still on a shelf in his office, above his own desk. He has started a notebook of his own. Plain composition notebook, blue cover. He writes down what works. He writes down what doesn't. Deshaun Webb had written in his 1991 notebook, toward the end of the Gerald Pittman section, in his small, tight hand, "The knowledge doesn't go to the one who wants it most. It goes to the one who writes it down, and then goes looking." He didn't write it as advice. He wrote it because it seemed true. He didn't know who would read it. That's usually how it works.